Hi, this is Lynn McCool. Today I want to discuss with you the first of the 5 canons of rhetoric, the canon of invention, as we begin to discuss speech essentials. Your book talks about something called the categories or topoi of invention. These are also known as artistic proofs. Topoi, or better translated into English topics, literally comes from the Greek and it means places. When we talk about rhetoric, the topics or the topoi are the ways in which we relate ideas together. So the topics of invention or the topoi of invention represent specific ways of placing material into relationships that ideally bring about new questions and new insights. As I mentioned earlier, Aristotle divided the topoi into 2 basic categories, something that he called artistic and inartistic proofs. Artistic proofs actually have to do with ethos, pathos, and logos, and they are those arguments that the speaker must invent. In other words, the speaker must create the argument himself or herself using things such as definition, comparison, demonstrating relationships between objects, the use of circumstances, or testimony. Inartistic proofs, on the other hand, are using things that already are established by quoting what other people have said. So, for example, quoting laws, using expert witness testimony, the use of contracts or oaths. All of those are considered inartistic proofs. Let's look a little more in depth at the artistic proofs. Again, this is the method in which we are using those rhetorical appeals of logos, pathos, and ethos. And there are several different types of artistic proofs. The first kind is called definition, or sometimes its more formal name is genus. And it asks something to define itself properly. So, of course, oftentimes when we begin to discuss or talk about an item, we will begin by defining terms, and that's always a very good place to begin, and it's a good thing to do whenever we are trying to persuade someone of something, is to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what we mean by a certain word or term. Next, another category of topoi or of invention is something called division. It's also sometimes called contraries. And this particular category takes something that seems to be whole and breaks it into its constituent parts, or it can also look at something that's already broken apart and try to piece it back together to get the whole picture. So division tells us how to break something apart or how to put it back together. Comparison takes 2 different things and puts them side by side to show their similarities and differences, and often comparison is used to make one thing seem more valuable or desirable than another. Next, we have something called relationship, also known as cause-effect relationship, and this puts 2 or more things into a causal relationship to one another in order for the listener or the reader to understand how something was produced. So this relationship asks how one thing influenced another. And we can even have what we call a causal chain, where an initial cause influences something and that becomes an effect, but then that in turn becomes a cause for something else which produces an effect, and we can have what we call the domino effect or a causal chain from the cause-effect relationship. Next, we have something called similitude or analogy, and this is a statement about the likeness of 2 things. So I've given you a little logical proof here using similitude or analogy, and I just use letters to represent ideas or things. So if I say if S, so something, you could place anything in there. If S resembles P, in X particulars. So in other words, if a dog resembles a wolf in these certain aspects, it's probable that S resembles P in 1 or more further particulars. So it's probable that dogs resemble wolves in more than one way. Okay? That'd be the first sort of establishment of that line of logic or reasoning. The next logical step would be to say that S does resemble P in X particulars, so that dogs do resemble wolves in the fact that they have 4 legs, a tail, sort of pointed noses, and so forth. And then the third logical step would be to bring about the conclusion, and that's what the word therefore indicates. Therefore, it's probable that S resembles P in one or more further particulars. So therefore, it's probable that dogs resemble wolves in additional specific characteristics. Another type of artistic proof is called the example. And examples are descriptions of actual or hypothetical events, people, objects, or processes that can embody an idea or argument in a concrete form so that audiences can see what it means. And examples are very effective and useful, especially when we're trying to persuade. Examples can be drawn from newspapers, history, biographies, science, or even personal experience. Now, there are several different types of examples. For example, we can have what we call actual examples, and these are descriptions of real things that have existed or that currently exist. And main sources for these kinds of examples include the news or personal experience or scientific discovery. Actual examples are important for lending credibility to a speech and by making the speech appear thoroughly researched and backed by evidence rather than just personal opinion. So examples are very useful and helpful in building the logos, the argumentation portion of our speech. We can also, though, use a subcategory of examples called fictional examples, and these are descriptions of events that are only imagined to have happened either in the past, the present, or the future. And in these fictional examples, we can either take what we call a third-person approach or a second-person approach. Now, the third-person approach would use the pronouns he or she, that third sort of objective viewpoint, and it would describe actions of other people as if they actually happened, but then the speaker reveals at the end that it's only a story. And this happens quite frequently when we are using stories or narratives from literature to try to illustrate or exemplify something. The second kind of fictional example is what we call second person, or using you, and this places the audience themselves inside of the hypothetical situation and asks them to envision something. And usually it offers the audience a choice in order to get them thinking about the problem. So for example, this type of fictional example using second person you would say, okay, imagine if you were on a desert island. All right away, I've already placed the audience inside of the example, and so now I'm asking them to think along with me as I work out the example. Another method or topoi of invention is narrative, and you can see how some of these sort of overlap a little bit. Narratives are a dramatic story that is more complex than an example, and a narrative is designed to capture and hold the attention of an audience by promising that through the unfolding of the plot and the characters that advance that plot, something new and satisfying will be produced at the end. Narratives are useful because they can convey complex states of affairs in ways that are memorable. Narrative can offer fidelity because it refers to how accurately a narrative represents accepted facts. Narrative probability refers to the coherence of the narrative as a story apart from the actual facts. And we would consider a narrative to be strong when it has both high probability and high fidelity. So in other words, when it accurately represents accepted facts and when the coherence of the story checks out. In other words, the story makes sense in the way that it's told. And of course, we can see that narratives and examples and even testimony, that there's a little bit of an overlap with each of these kinds of proofs, but they do have a fine layer of distinction. All right, another topoi of invention is a maxim, and a maxim is a short, pithy statement expressing a general truth or rule of conduct, and it often appeals to an audience's hidden assumptions. So for example, if I say something like, the early bird gets the worm, or a stitch in time saves 9, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These are all maxims that are attributed to Ben Franklin, and they are a part of our public consciousness, they're part of our cultural heritage. And if I were to say one of those maxims, typically the average American person would understand the message the hidden understanding, the message behind that little pithy statement. Okay, we've talked at length about artistic proofs. Those are the proofs, again, that are invented by the speaker. Now let's just focus for a minute on the other category, which are inartistic proofs, and those are an undisputed collection of facts that reside in a truth statement about the reality of the world or the way that things are. And so inartistic proofs are merely used by the speaker. They're not invented by the speaker, so the speaker would go out and gather these inartistic proofs, and this is part of the research process actually. When we're putting together a speech or a written composition, this is where we go out to find information and find those facts and statistics and even expert testimony about something, so that we can use that then to build our artistic proofs. So as you probably know, facts are a condensed empirical claim that tells us about some facet of the world that we can rely upon to be true. Statistics are mathematical generalizations that help us make predictions about certain types of objects or events, and statistics show either magnitude or probability. And then testimony is often put under the artistic proof category, so it can reside there. But it also can be considered part of inartistic proofs, especially if we're looking at what we call expert testimony. So these are individuals who have expert knowledge in a particular subject or a field. So just as an example, let's say I am interested in researching about vaccines, and I go up to a respected university like, let's say, Iowa State, and I go talk to a biochemist up there who is actually in the process of researching how to create a needleless vaccine. Okay, this is considered an expert testimony, the information that he gives to me, because he's directly related to that field. He's actively researching in it. He has content and subject matter knowledge. He's an expert in that, and I could rely on his information to be factual and to be to have a truth statement associated with it. Now you can see that there are other kinds of testimony, and depending upon the type of testimony it is, again, testimony sort of bridges the gap between artistic and inartistic proof. But you can see that we can have lay testimony. This comes from ordinary people who have relevant experience about an issue. Expert testimony, they may have directly experienced whatever it is that we're researching, or they may just have a considerable amount of knowledge about it. Prestige testimony comes from famous and well-respected individuals, and this would probably be the least credible in some ways than the other two. All right, I'm going to wrap this up with just a brief thought about how invention and research then work together. So going out to find ideas, those places where we can use information to develop our lines of argumentation in our speech making ability. And of course that has to be done with careful research. And one of the best ways that you can establish your own ethos is by doing careful research, using credible sources, making sure that you have a depth and breadth of source material, and that if you're searching on the web, which most of us do, that those web searches are done carefully, that you vet your sources. In other words, you carefully check them out, make sure that they're credible, and finally, that you document your sources fully. And I'm perfectly fine with having you use some kind of citation generator like EasyBib or some other citation generator that you prefer, but that's fine as long as after the software has generated the citation, you go back through and you carefully check to make sure that every element and every part of that citation is fully documented and represented in the best manner possible. Okay, that wraps up our discussion about invention, and as the days and weeks follow, I will continue to work through each of the 5 canons to show you how you can use each one of these in the speech making process. That's all for now. I'll talk to you again soon, and if you have questions, please contact me. Thanks.